All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Jenny Helms-Calvin. Jenny, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Guy.
All right, we're going to do this. So Jenny is a licensed therapist with over 230,000 followers on TikTok. She also founded and owns Soma Therapy, the largest mental health practice in Kansas with over 50 mental health providers. Her jam is talking about self-worth, attachment trauma, and how people can heal from their bullshit trauma narratives and live a badass life. All right, welcome to the podcast. Let's do this.
Yes, let's do this. Let's dig into it.
All right. So let's start here. Let's walk us through how you got into this field. And then I want to dive in specifically about your interests in self-worth and attachment trauma, because I share those interests too. So go.
Awesome. So starting at birth, no, I'm just kidding. Like many therapists in this field, I came from a place of my own wounding, my own trauma. The years that I spent doing my own work, I originally got into therapy as a teenager, kicking and screaming. But yeah, I came into the field as a wounded healer, and that was what really sparked my interest. I had a wonderful psychologist that I worked with as a teenager that I truly feel transformed my life.
Wow.
I had a really awful eating disorder that I was diagnosed with at 15. And in about 3.5 years to 4 years, I was able to be what we would call fully recovered, at least from the eating disorder. That didn't mean that I was out of the woods and other things that I was still working through in my own trauma journey. But it was really powerful for me. And I remember being fascinated by the things I was learning, and it just opening this whole world of opportunity. And so with my natural curiosity and love of learning about humans and therapy itself, I was kind of a weirdo, and even going into college knew that I wanted to be a therapist. Like that was something that I wanted from a really, I guess, a younger age than I think most of the therapists I know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what sparked the journey to being where I am today.
So how old were you? You said a teenager. How old were you when you started therapy?
So I started therapy in middle school initially. I wouldn't say that it was very helpful for me at the time, and not necessarily because of the therapist, but because I was in a space I wasn't really willing or ready to do the work. I would come in and be the teenager that didn't want to talk about anything, and kind of thought therapy was a joke. In fact, I have said the exact words of, I think that therapists are, the only thing that's smart about therapists is that they've tricked people into giving them money to just sit around all day and talk to them. So I have said those exact words. And now obviously I'm a big believer. And I remember thinking that therapy was just really silly until I finally, I guess, kicking and screaming was able to do the work at some point, and had made some breakthroughs with the therapist that I kind of attribute to, again, getting me interested in this field in the first place.
So you spoke highly of that therapist. What was it about that therapist that really got you, inspired
So
you?
I know it's kind of interesting. I felt like it was the first therapist that, she was not a BSer. She would tell me what was up. And she wasn't scared of me. And I know that sounds silly, but I felt in some of the other experiences I had with therapists, I would, even if I started sharing a little bit about my story, I felt like they were scared of the fact that I was so angsty and that I was, I don't know. I almost felt like I remember thinking like they can't really handle or hold the weight of what I'm about to share or how I
Mm-hmm.
feel. So might as well not even try.
Right.
And with this therapist, something about her made me feel like she almost fired me my first session. And that was actually a really great moment for me because, again, in my mind, I had connected the dots that, okay, she's not scared of me. She's going to set some boundaries.
What did she do?
Um,
What did she say?
oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the exact words. Again, I'm probably still sassy in certain ways, but I was giving her sass about something and probably about therapy and how, like, what's the point? I'm not going to do
Mm-hmm.
the work. And she was like, well, if you're not going to do the work, there's the door. Don't waste my time and don't waste yours. And I remember being like, whoa, wait a minute. You're
Mm-hmm.
actually, you're challenging me there and
Mm-hmm.
setting a boundary. And um, it was, yeah, it was good. It challenged me and it made me realize she's not afraid of me. She's not going to put up with my sass. And I needed that at the
Wow.
time.
She sounds
Mm-hmm.
pretty awesome. Also,
Yeah.
it just sounded like it was a good fit at the right time. She knew what to say at the right time, right? You obviously, maybe had she said that to someone else, it wouldn't have worked. But all right, so you had an incredible experience there. You said you got to college and you knew you wanted to focus on therapy, become a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you do?
I did my undergrad at the University of Georgia and I studied psychology. I loved all my psychology classes. I loved all my sociology classes. I would delve into it. I would talk to the graduate assistants and I got involved in research. Although research is not my jam, I still was really fascinated by the process of it. And I just wanted to be around the people that were involved in it. And eventually I thought I was always going to go and get my graduate degree in psychology. However, through my journey, I met some marriage and family therapists, and it when they started talking about family systems and how systems impact the therapy process in individuals, it it just connected some dots for me and just opened my brain up to a totally different world. And I felt like I started to see the world through a different lens. And at that point, I wanted to pursue that because I really appreciated how systemic therapy brings in that relational aspect. It brings in the
Mm-hmm.
systems and how that impacts a person's mental health, how they behave within a system. And so, yeah, I kind of switched routes at that point. I also started to realize like I didn't have to get my PhD to practice therapy. And at the time, being a broke college student, that sounded financially great to me that I didn't have to go to school for even longer and take out even more
Right.
student debt. So I won't lie, there were some logistical pieces too of just like how can I practically save money or not, I guess save money and not having to go to school so long and have to pay even more money before I can start my career. But yeah, I think those things combined, I switched journeys into wanting to be a marriage and family therapist. And that was, that has worked out really well for me so far.
So you got your degree, and then when did you start working professionally?
So it's kind of interesting. My graduate school experience, and I think in a weird way, looking back, this was a good thing for me. I started grad school at one college. I had a quarter life crisis and I had this moment of, do I really want to be a therapist or am I being a therapist because I had an eating disorder? And I had this whole thing happen to me. Like, is this really the path I want to do? And so I actually dropped out of grad school a year in at Colorado State University. And I remember like I had good grades. I had like a graduate assistantship. Everybody's like, what are you doing? Like you literally just have to hang in there for one more year. And I was like, no, I've got to figure out if this is really what I want to do. And I'm also just internally, I was having a lot of mental health struggles at that point. And I was like, how am I going to serve other people if, self as a therapist, I am internally in a space of struggling with depression and this quarter life
Mm-hmm.
crisis that I'm having. And so I stepped away from that. and spent about a year kind of figuring things out in some messy ways, and ended up in Wichita, Kansas with one of my ex-boyfriends. I moved there with him. And I realized over time, I still loved the field. I still found that I was reading certain books and listening to certain podcasts and everything related to therapy and psychology and trauma and attachment. And so I ended up reapplying for grad school. And I ended up going to Friends University here in Wichita, Kansas, an amazing program. I never heard of it. I won't lie. Like when I first heard about it, I was like, Friends University, because it didn't really have like the research clout or anything else that other programs had. And I would joke about it, but it clinically was such a great program. They really trained us to be self-reflective and work within our own cohort to really help each other get feedback and grow as clinicians. And the professors were amazing. Looking back, I think it was really great because I left that program feeling competent and just in a good space, ready to really work with people.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story and the personal aspects of it. I realize that can be challenging. We're opening up our souls in a sense here, or you are. Okay, you kind of talked a little bit about it, but share with us how this interest in self-worth and attachment trauma blossomed for you.
I think
why did it become important?
Why did it become important? I don't think I realized that many of the things that I struggled with, throughout my childhood, and even that led to me struggling with such a severe eating disorder, were tied to my self-worth, and that my self-worth was tied to attachment trauma until a lot later in my own healing journey. That, in my family system, we had a lot of change. I did not grow up with my bio dad. My parents got divorced when I was I don't say incredibly young. I was 4. And I think there were just certain things that had happened in my life that at some point I survived by trying to be something that I really wasn't. I survived by reading other people and trying to ensure that everybody else was okay. And that people, and part of that was like, again, stemming back to self-worth. I felt like my self-worth came from being able to take care of people and being able to be liked by people. And then eventually the cultural messaging that I received being a kid growing up in the 90s was that my self-worth came from what I looked like. Especially, and I think it applies to men as well, but especially being a female, I picked up on these messages that being pretty or being skinny had power. That was a woman's power, quote unquote. Again, I put that in parentheses because that's obviously not what I believe now, but those were very, very strong messages to me as a kid. I remember watching shows like, I don't know if you remember the show or watched it, but it was called The Swan. And people would literally go on it and they would give them like 8 different plastic surgeries and like put makeup on them and have them like come out. And it was like, look how much better their life is now.
I think I do.
Like it was just a horrible like messaging of like, this is how to make yourself happy. Yeah. So those were different pieces, I think, that started that journey where I started to realize in my journey, and then even being in the school of hard knocks, which I say that in respect to the fact that like in my journey of healing, I was hospitalized 3 different times and just spent a lot of time with other people that had also struggled with severe eating disorders. And it seemed to be just this reoccurring pattern of perfectionism, shame, just not being enough. These were people that are very high functioning, very, kind of more attractive than the average person, still not feeling enough, perfectionistic individuals. And obviously that wasn't every person, but we all would agree that we somehow had this narrative that our worth or our feeling of being in control was tied to our body and what we looked like and our relationship with food. And so going through that process personally, seeing it with my own clients, again, it's not necessarily the case for everybody that's completely tied to their self-worth in that way. But usually when you get down to the issues of even over control, it comes down to this narrative of me being messy and me being out of control is not safe, is not okay for X, Y, and Z. And often it stems from a place of, I have to have it together enough, or I have to have control over something, because if I don't, what does that mean about my own safety and my own identity? So I think that's kind of this roundabout way of there's so many different pieces that lead back to it. But when we think about our healing journey and trauma, I think that the thing that is at its center is how we've lost a safe, good, solid relationship with ourselves and what that means. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate what you're saying. And I think that just the way you're articulating it is really resonating, certainly with me, and I know with a lot of our listeners. So how did you get to the point where you created somatherapy, which is, you founded somatherapy? It's now the largest mental health practice in Kansas, which is really friggin' impressive. How did you get to the point where you said, I want to do this?
So it's interesting how going through my own journey, and again, I'm still, none of us ever arrive necessarily, but I think Soma was part of that journey, because I originally was going to start it with two other people. And on the night of us signing the contract, one of them had left prior to that, and I kind of knew they weren't going to be involved. But on the night of us signing our contracts, the other one left, or basically said, "Hey, I'm out." And I had one of those dark nights of the soul where I was like, "Oh, am I going to do this?" And I was like a total mess on my couch. What am I going to do? And my now husband at the time was just like, "I don't even know what to do with you, because you're just a crying puddle on the couch right now." He's like, "I'm going to come back when you're ready, but I love you. And we'll figure this out." And by the morning, I just somehow there was a sense of clarity of, I just want to give it a shot. I just sink or swim. I want to give it a year. I am fortunate enough to have this space in my life that I don't have kids. I have the time and energy to give to this, even if I don't have all the money and resources to give to it. I had all the other things, and I was like, I'm just going to give it a go for a year and see what happens. And so I committed to myself
for 1 second. How long had you been practicing before you did this?
So I was practicing for about two and a half years.
Okay.
So pretty early baby therapist.
Yeah.
Right.
And why did you want to do this? Why did you want to found your own business?
I always knew that I wanted to create something, especially in our community. We didn't have something that had different practitioners all together and didn't bring in, medication management and yoga and have a holistic approach. So I always knew that was something that I wanted to help create at some point and provide as a resource for our Wichita community. I didn't exactly know how that would look like and when that would happen, but I knew that was something that was really interesting to me. And I naturally love getting out in the community and connecting with people too. So I already had this knack for connecting, marketing, creating resources. And I knew that it was kind of rare to have a therapist that also enjoyed the marketing side of things, because most therapists I meet, they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with marketing, putting myself out there, no, thank you. And I loved it. And so I was like, this might be a unique opportunity that, even though I don't have the business chops yet, I trusted in my ability to learn it, and knowing that I had those other two pieces and just a passion for it. I really think, when we have a community and we have really good mental health resources and therapists, when we heal trauma, we progress a city, because when people heal trauma, they're more innovative, they're more creative, they're more connected. And that creates economic and social goodness for the entire community. So I also was thinking like systemically, like, how can I create change in Wichita? Because I started to be something that I cared about was how do we create change here? So yeah, those were all the things that were like, okay, I want to create something. And then when I had people that were like, hey, we've been in business for 7 years, let's help you with this, I was like, sweet, I've got my backup, I've got my support. And so that was when like, I was like, let's do it. I started that process, and yeah, that kind of led me into, starting it.
I want to kind of go back a little bit and ask you about, when you came to the understanding or the realization that what you were experiencing with your eating disorder and maybe other things was related to your own trauma, how did you realize that?
So I didn't at first. When I was going through my journey, I remember originally telling my therapist that my childhood was really great. And part of that was I also had some religious narratives around like what you say and what's right and things like that. And as I went through my journey with her, that's when I started to realize, like, I would share things with her. And it wasn't like she necessarily reacted and be like, oh my gosh, that's crazy or bad. But she started to ask questions and hold space, where it was the first time I had ever challenged that maybe things weren't normal in my family system. Because again, at that point in my life, I had internalized everything as being my fault, or the ways that I was feeling and responding to life was all because something was wrong with me. That was my narrative. And as I started to understand that there were other things at play that were creating these feelings of not having safety and struggling with anxiety, and that even like my bodily sensations, like again, the trauma that I had stored in my body, I just thought was a defect in me. Like that was the narrative. And I didn't share that with people because I was like, well, that's something that you hide away and don't tell anybody about. Right. And so that's where like it became me hiding that and me having shame around, the ways that my body was having, was trying to process trauma. I started to develop these, my way of dealing with it eventually became the eating disorder. Because when I had that, I felt like I could control my body more in that. And I wasn't as connected to those feelings. I had rules that made me feel safer and less defective. And one of the weird things people don't realize about eating disorders too, is that for some people, especially when they have anorexia nervosa, they almost get a sense of feeling self-confidence or self-worth from their eating disorder, because they feel pride in the fact that they can like be so rigid and so strict and so extreme. And it's like the one thing they feel good about. So to take that away from them is like, it's an excruciating process, because they don't underneath that, where else can they get their feelings of self-confidence and worth and control.
Right. Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Jenny Helms-Calvin. What's the best place for people to reach you?
So they can reach me by social media. I have an Instagram and a TikTok.
Okay.
At Jenny Ann Helms, JennyAnnHelms.
Okay. We'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So how did TikTok come about for you? And why did it come about for you?
Yeah.
Let me just say that you
TikTok
have over 230,000 followers on TikTok.
Yes.
Wow. I mean, come on. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So when I was going through the initial phases of marketing with Soma and then, so fun story about Soma. So we started And then a year in, we were at a space where I was like, all right, I'm going to go into a much bigger building because we were growing and it was awesome. And I was like, yes. So we go into this bigger building, and then the pandemic hits literally 2 weeks after we move in, like where everything's shut down. We all basically are working from home. All of that happens. And during that time, for a while, I remember scrolling through social media and seeing that there were so many posts that were giving terrible, awful advice or ideas to people around what to do with their relationships or what to do with their feelings of insecurity and things like that. Things like, don't text someone back for 8 hours. And then, like just like silly rules that at the heart of it, I started to realize people were going to social media to get answers for their problems with relationships and their feelings of self-worth and essentially, their mental health, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they were going to these creators that were giving them just really garbage advice, like creating communities around codependency and all sorts of things. So when I saw that, I was like, we need to just have more people in the space, just not necessarily, again, it's not therapy. We're not like replacing it, but how do we give enough education for people to connect the dots that they would benefit so much from seeing a therapist, that this issue they're going to Instagram for is really something that like they could work on and reflect on with a therapist. And so a lot of the work that I did was just to give people education and help them understand, like, if I can educate them about these issues and then like also along that way realize, okay, this is something that I can heal and deal with a therapist, a licensed professional, that would be amazing. And so I just started creating these TikToks. And I remember just thinking like, I'm just going to post like 4 times a week. And I'm just going to keep that going for a year. And again, I don't know why, but in my brain, I'm like, if I just do something for a year, see what happens, cool. And so within a year, I had over 100,000 followers. Just by posting every day. I mean, if you look at my earlier TikToks, they're terrible, but I just kept going and just like,
and how long
okay,
are
what's
the
resonating?
How long?
Most of them are about 30 seconds.
So super
less.
short.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
what if you can, well, give us an idea of something you share specifically, if you can remember a particular one that you've shared recently. What have you done?
So it could be something like signs of burnout, signs of, this type of attachment wound, or, and it's not saying, hey, you have this thing, or, hey, like, this is how to specifically treat it. Because again, all of us have very unique and individual contexts, but it's more of giving people awareness that I've had so many people comment, like, I'm checking all these boxes. Now I want to look more into this. Or I didn't even realize that this was like, it was kind of I feel like it was the dots that I was connecting in therapy as a teen, where I was like, oh, my childhood wasn't normal. Like, it wasn't normal to be, ignored by a parent for days at a time, or like, whatever it was that, again, in my brain, like I was like, oh, that's just normal. And I think it's just helped for people to just start asking those questions and connecting those dots for themselves so that they could actually do the work in therapy, hopefully. I mean, that's what I try to get people to do, but obviously it's their life and their journey. So,
well, obviously you're striking a huge nerve. As we kind of wind down here, Jenny, what do you think? I mean, obviously you're super passionate and you're super smart and you're super savvy, and you're an incredible connector. What do you feel what's driving you, first of all? That's the first question in all of this.
It drives me. I want to be thoughtful and give as honest of a reason as I can, because I think some of it comes from a genuine value and place of passion. I'm sure some of it also comes just still from parts of myself that I'm still healing, right? Like still, because I think it's honest for us to say that, like, or at least for me to say that, while I think the heart of what I do and the energy of what I do is good, I still have to be really good about checking in with myself and saying, is this also still from a place of trying to prove my self-worth, right? That is something I'm going to have to constantly check in with myself about. And so I've really tried to be thoughtful in this journey of like making sure that despite whatever outcomes, I'm just still putting myself out there and being vulnerable from a good space of not needing anything necessarily from it. And also honoring my work-life balance. Like my first year doing things, that was terrible. I had terrible work-life balance. But now that I'm about 3-4 years into it, I take my weekends off completely. Like I shut things down. I honor things in ways that like I didn't originally, but it took me time to really catch that and honor that and realize like it's okay to not always quote unquote be hustling and doing things. So it definitely comes from a place of wanting to give back in the ways that I was given to, and probably still a little bit from my own trauma. I'm still healing on this journey.
Awesome. Well, Jenny, I'd love to have you back. I think you have an incredible way of articulating your process and how it is important, because I really do think what you're saying is important. And I loved what you said about the importance of healing trauma and its impact on the system, right? In which we live. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And like I said, love to have you back at a later time, and we can continue the discussion.
Awesome. That sounds great, Guy. Thank you for having me.
All right, Jenny, take care. I want to thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I want to let you know that I am very excited about my new podcast, The Right Now Project. The Right Now Project is about healing. It's about stepping into our own courage and authenticity and getting started or continuing along our healing process. We're all going through something, whatever it is, in this crazy life we're living. And the Right Now Project is about honoring that, celebrating that, and sharing our stories via the associated membership site. Check us out at therightnowproject.com, therightnowproject.com.